Okay, thank you, David. The title of this project, which we finished at the end of last year, was developing a resource allocation framework to support more effective police investigations in the serious and organised crime area. And this is an area, of course, where performance measures really don't count. The number of crimes and the resolution rate, unlike volume crime, is not a particularly meaningful performance measure. I was at Monash University when we did this research, so I'm no longer there, so I've taken the headline off. The overall aim of the project was faced with competing demands for resources. Nobody's got enough resources to satisfy demand, and demand is completely unpredictable. What's the evidence base that exists to show how resources are allocated or perhaps should be allocated in serious and organised crime investigations? A lot of this is done kind of intuitively by experience. What I was looking for was, is there an evidence base to support that? Is there an evidence base to support how that might possibly be improved? Now, when we came into this project, it was really good because Crime Department had introduced a detective timesheet recording system that had only just started up. So we were able to collect over that period 1.5 million hours of detective timesheet time across all of the serious and organised crime investigations over a period of 3.5 years. Amongst that, we selected 248 jobs that were fairly major jobs that started and finished within that 3.5 year time frame. They comprised 28% of the total timesheet hours for those jobs, and we matched those hours with the detailed progress of the investigation from the time the crime was reported right through to when it was completed, whether there was a successful court outcome or not. So we were able to track the detailed progress of each investigation and link that in with the time allocations. And that's a pretty significant sample of all of the times, all of the hours during that period of time. So this is the kind of thing that we had. This is just a sample investigation. It started in February 2008, finished in June 2010. We broke it down over its major phases of activity. The first one was when the investigation was active. The second stage was when it went into brief preparation, then when it was active at court until it was completed. And we plotted the hours of detectives' time month by month over that period of time. And we then plotted some key events against that. So things like arrests, there's a lot more than what was able to be shown here. The different colours represent different squads that were working on the investigation. There were various priorities that were assigned during the course of the investigation. So we were able to plot that for all 248 jobs. I mean, that's interesting in itself, but doesn't tell you anything more holistically. Now, what we looked at for those 248 jobs were the kinds of characteristics. So what was the crime? Was it homicide, arson, fraud, etc.? Was it a reported crime or was it a proactive targeted crime? Was the suspect identified at the scene of the crime? Was the victim uncooperative or cooperative, such as in drug offences? A whole lot of things like that. We captured all of that. We captured constraints that were reported, which might be as simple as police staff being on leave, waiting for specialist resources like covert or transcription typing and so forth. We looked at the elapsed time of the investigation, so how long it took from start to finish. We looked at the peak times, or saturation points. So this was a peak, what happened at that particular peak and what happened at the other peak times of resource allocation. We looked at the investigative progress from start to finish, and we looked at the setting of priorities throughout that period. And there were priorities set for the crimes investigation overall, and there were priorities set particularly for covert resources, which are often a major ingredient in serious and organised crime. We looked at the outcome, whether that was successful prosecution or whatever it might have been. And we looked at the post-completion review that the detectives did in terms of what worked and what didn't work during the course of the investigation. So what we needed to do was try to find some broad principles that arose out of all of those jobs. So we used a process that's called clustering. It's kind of a data mining technique We didn't do much. We did a little bit of statistical analysis, but not very much, because what the statistical analysis requires is some sort of pre-established hypotheses. And this particular technique that's used a lot in information technology really finds clusters of data which don't have to be pre-identified before you start looking at this. I haven't got time to go into the method, but it is fairly well used, developed by Cohonen, and there's a piece of software that helps us to do that. And we found three broad clusters of resource allocations. One was different resource allocations based on the job characteristics, things like, obviously, you know, uncooperative victims or suspects known at the scene of the crime. The second type of cluster was based on different patterns of resource allocation over time, so what happened at different stages of the investigation. And the third one were different clusters in relation to what were the particular peaks. Did certain types of investigation have different peaks to other types of investigation, or saturation points as we called it. So these three kind of clusters kind of gave us a bit more information around what were the particular characteristics of crimes and the investigation process that we could draw some conclusions from. Now, one of the things that kind of motivated the research was, could we come up with some kind of an algorithm, a magic formula that sort of says if you do A, B, C, D, F, G, then you've got the most likely outcome of getting outcome X. Well, probably fairly obviously you'd know that you wouldn't be able to do that. It was a nice idea. There was no magic formula for resource allocations, certainly not at the operational level. And as we've said before, performance measures don't really mean anything where you've got a small number of investigations, small number of crimes, but they're very high significance. So what we found was that pretty much it was a heuristic basis. So it was intuition, experience, gut feel, hindsight that drove resource allocation decisions. That, however, was based on, or that experience, intuition, etc., was based on a framework of processes that had been put in place in Victoria Police. Firstly, a prioritisation of investigations, so a triaging kind of system, the development of an investigation plan for each crime investigation, a fairly sophisticated tasking and coordination process, which at that stage of the research had 5 different levels, from the individual crime reporting right through to an overall force-wide analysis of priorities, and the review and evaluation process that took place at the end of that. So all of these things kind of informed the heuristics. So there's kind of this sort of interactive double learning loop that was taking place. So rather than come up with a magic formula, which would have been nice but unlikely, our data reinforced what detectives kind of already know, which is nice, except, well, you could sort of say, well, so what? Except that there's been no data to support detective heuristics. People can dismiss experience, intuition, hindsight because there's actually no data to support it. We've actually come up with a set of data that actually supports that experience, intuition and hindsight, which I think in a sense is actually quite useful to have. The second kind of major finding out of the research is what we call a hierarchy of capabilities. There are lots of different capabilities that influence the ability to combat crime. There's clearly the operational level, detectives' knowledge and experience built up through training and experience over long periods of time. But in addition to that, there's a whole lot of informational capability, a lot of information kept in databases. The tasking and coordination process itself had a lot of knowledge built into it, a lot of experience built into it that was informing those operational capabilities. Building up a lot of relationship capabilities with other criminal justice agencies, with the DPP, with other police forces, with the federal police and so forth. Strategic capabilities, the ability to identify and respond to changing trends so that you weren't always responding to crimes, that you're actually looking at strategies for things that were changing right now so that you're able to respond to those things a little bit ahead of the game and at least plan and be a bit more proactive and a bit more targeted. Political capabilities, the ability to influence people outside the criminal justice system, influencing the government in terms of resources, influencing the government in terms of legislation, what legislation needs to change in order to address gaps that smart solicitors seem to find, target hardening, things like that. And I guess the top level of our hierarchy of capabilities was this thing about learning. So it's about policing's very good, or certainly systems that existed in crime department were very good at acquiring knowledge and retaining knowledge. The data that was in the IT systems that we saw was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Unfortunately, it wasn't used and shared very well, okay? But it was there. Now, often when I do research, particularly in private sector organisations, you often find the data isn't there. Well, wouldn't it be nice if we had this data? What really was interesting about this research was the data was there. It was there on an individual case basis, but it really hadn't been aggregated and it really hadn't been analysed across multiple investigations. Key learning for Victoria Police out of the research, there were 14 specific recommendations. I keep asking David which ones, if any, have been implemented as yet, and it's an ongoing process. Some of them cost money, unfortunately, as is always the case. So I'm not going to go through the 14, but there were 3 very broad, high-level kinds of areas of recommendation. The first one was this opportunity to learn and improve. So detectives are smart, you know, and within squads, within specialist squads, they would learn and they would share experiences and so forth. But I saw not much opportunity for that learning to take place across between different specialist squads, okay? Or over long periods of time when people move in and out of the organisation. So a lot of anecdotal and informal learning and improvement, but not a lot that was sophisticated or structured. Why? Partly because the data in the crime recording system, the crime investigation system called Interpose, for those of you in VicPol, was kind of lost in the narratives. Very long, sweeping narratives of detail rather than what IT people would see as structured fields that can then be searched and analysed. So a lot of the data was kind of there, but it was lost. And again, the ability to analyse data across jobs, across specialist work groups, specialist squads and task forces really wasn't there. The second major area was around bottlenecks, and detectives will always ask for more detective resources because, you know, that's the kind of game that they're in. But what was so obvious to me in this research was the bottlenecks weren't so much in the area of detectives themselves, they were in the specialist resources. They were waiting for covert resources of various kinds. I mean, a key ingredient to many serious and organised crimes. But it was also things like forensic accountants and lawyers, it was tape transcription typing, it was interpreters, it was all those kind of specialist resources that prevented an investigation from progressing on to the next stage. And what we found out of that was this data that supports the heuristics really provides a very good support base to support a business case for additional resources. Now, whether government gives you the additional resources is, of course, an entirely different thing. But I think the data there supports a strong business case, either for more IT investment to improve this system so that you get more structured data and you can actually access the data across a broader area, or for more specialist resources, because I think that's the thing that breaks down the bottleneck, and that's the thing that will enable the investigation to proceed more quickly. The last thing I wanted to mention was in terms of the research progress that David asked me to comment on. This was a 4-year project. 3 years of it was an ARC linkage, and the first year Victoria Police gave us a bit of a pilot research grant to do some initial work, which for those of you going for ARC grants is always helpful if you can do a little pilot research study first. As our last speaker said, we had a large transition of senior police management throughout the course of the program. I think the sort of superintendents who looked after the project changed at least 3 times during the course of that 4 years. Again, having done research in the private sector, that's a real worry for a researcher, because if you lose that commitment, you can lose access to the organisation and you get halfway through and suddenly it stops. That didn't happen, and I'm really impressed with the fact that that commitment continued irrespective of who was running the show in there. One of the things that helped that was the consistency of the unsworn staff in what was then called the crime strategy group, some of the people who are here today, who were consistent throughout that project and helped that sense of continuity, and presumably behind the scenes talk to the superintendents and sort of said this is an important project. And also giving credit to David's area in the research services area, there was a whole project management structure that was put in place. Risks were identified, what the problems might occur in terms of progressing the research. They were managed. There were two simultaneous projects that were taking place in the crime department at the time. They started and finished at the same time. They were looking at very similar areas, but we wanted to make sure there was no overlap, but also that we didn't leave a gap between the two projects, that they actually fitted together quite nicely. And fortunately, as the two research groups, we were able to do that. But again, that was helped by the fact that the project management looked at both projects at the same time. We had common meetings and so forth. And we also did regular presentations to senior management. So at least a couple of times a year, we were giving presentations to the senior management group around that. So overall, a fairly successful project, and we look forward to seeing what recommendations might come out of that. Thank you.